So these are the 5 key specific phobias, right, that we're all aware of. Specific phobias are the most common kinds of anxiety disorders for kids with autism too, at least reported by parents. Okay? If you drill down and you ask them, if you ask a parent, and you go through a structured ADIS, this is sets of specific phobias are typically the most common kind of type of anxiety disorder. So these are the 5 types. These are very common in kids with autism too. Interesting factoid, little tangent on anxiety phobias. So they did a study, I think it was at McGill. I always pick on McGill. So they did study, let's say it's at McGill, because I forget where it's actually from. where they poor undergraduate students, they did some of those kind of conditioning paradigms where they showed the students a picture of an animal and then they shocked them. And then they measured their galvanic skin response as a result, the fear reaction to the presentation of the stimuli in absence of the shock, right? So over time, you know what happens, right? Show the picture, eventually you show the picture without the shock and there's the same reaction, right? The body has the same reaction. And they did this regardless of the picture, right? It could be the fluffy bunny, it could have been the tarantula, the picture of the tarantula, whatever it was, they did it. What was really interesting is that and then what they do is afterwards to help the person, because you don't want a person constantly every time they see a picture of a bunny kind of like hopping, right? They went through an extinction paradigm where they showed the stimuli, right? And then eventually that reaction fades, right? And disappears back to neutral. That's kind of the natural extinction of that occurs to a learning paradigm. What was really interesting is that it took far longer for that extinction to occur when the picture of the animal evolutionarily was dangerous. So when it was like a picture of a snake or a spider, they still kind of adjusted back to their normal, but it took their body. It's not like they actually believe that spider is dangerous. Like they're not like, oh, I'm scared of it, but it actually took longer for that paradigm to fade, right? That's really interesting. And it tells something about, so that's kind of hardwired, right? That's like a biological piece where there's a notice. So when I think about that, I think about kids with autism and I think, what if not only are they quick to create associations between stimuli and a fear response, even when that fear response might not be something that's logically associated with that stimuli, like a fear response to a fire hydrant, but what if, and I have no data to suggest this, but what if it takes them longer to adjust because some part of them is hardwired to seeing that as evolutionarily dangerous? I don't know, I can't say that's what's gonna happen, but it helps me have a little bit more, even more empathy around the current situation about how hard it might be to get away from that fear, to address that fear response, because I might actually legitimately feel threatened by whatever stimuli is there, as if it's a tarantula. In the same way that for you or I, a tarantula is going to be faster in terms of a fear response than a fluffy dog is. So they might have these same 5 types of ongoing fear responses that are intense and excessive for the individual, right? Remember, they could have always had a fear response to puppies, but it was somewhat mild, and they didn't like it, but they stayed away, and they were fine. But now it's generalized, now it's far worse. It's, any potential issue, a dog, they're on a dog walking street, so they don't go outside because there might be a dog out there. They hear a bark and they run back inside. Right? Or any loud noise that sounds like a bark, they'll run, right? So it's manifest, it's evolved over time, so now it's a serious impairment to their functioning. So they might have all of these, and they might have the same physiological responses. So what happens? For most fear responses, you get a sympathetic response. What I mean by that is not that you feel sympathy for the person, but that their sympathetic system kind of kicks in, right? So you get that increased heart rate, kind of the fear response, right? That we all have, the sweatiness, that kind of bit. What's interesting is that blood-related phobias elicit this vasovagal response, right? That's the only one. People are often afraid when they often fear that when they see whatever it is, they're going to faint. When in actual fact, chances are it's the opposite. When you fear something, the part of you that kicks in actually is the mobilizing part. It's the opposite of the fainting part, except for blood type. When it comes to the blood one, that's where there is this kind of fear and actually legitimate possibility of fainting. Because what happens is the body actually lowers its blood pressure, right? You actually get a drop in blood pressure when somebody has a phobia to say blood or injections. And it makes a lot of sense if you think about it, right? Because, what are you afraid of? In that sense, you're afraid of kind of bleeding out, right? So what's your body's reaction to that going to be? It's going to be to lower its blood pressure and to make you faint so that you get on the floor as quickly as you can, right? Because that's the safest place to be if you're going to bleed out, right? But that isn't the safest place to be if there's a dog that's about to eat your face, okay? Safest place to be is to run as far as you can to get up the tree. So in this case, we do have a different reaction to that threat that's very content related. So keep in mind that the response is probably going to be a sympathetic style response in the child with autism, but you can also have this other response potentially of a loss of blood pressure if there's a fear response around kind of blood or injections or so on. So make sure when you're trying to ask about fears, that you go through those 5 kind of types. If you know there's one type, another thing to do is, if you know there's one phobia, to ask about the other content areas. And you can do this in an open way, but you know the 5 kind of common types of phobia, so ask about them. If you know there's a fear to animals, ask about injections, that's where structured questionnaires can be helpful because they can prompt you to do that, because where there's one, there's a potential for the other. But keep some open-ended ones just in case for these idiosyncratic fears as well, okay? And be wary of children who have a general hypersensitivity to startle in general, okay? So if somebody is just constantly quick, highly sensitive and quick to startle to anything, to any sudden noise, to anything new, anything potentially scary, for example, it might not be a specific phobia. Instead, it still might be an issue. It might be generalized anxiety, for example, right? So you want to be careful not to be overly specific. Make sense? You don't want to double code. So one thing to distinguish is are restricted interests related to the causing fear, okay? Is there negative affect about exposure, or is it the absence of exposure that causes the negative affect? Okay? When it comes to a fear response, right, it should be the presentation of, not the fear that you're not going to have the presentation of. I hope I said that right. If I'm afraid that you're not going to, show me the picture of the Pokemon, so I'm very scared of this whole situation, if that's what I'm afraid of, or you're not going to give me X, and I have a fear response as a result of what you're not going to give me, right? That's different than a specific phobia. So we need to distinguish between the two. It also can't be kind of transient, right? A specific phobia is just that. It's an enduring phobia. So somebody who's jumping around in their phobic responses from one content to another, just jumping around, is this quick to startle, but that's not something that you're going to conceptualize as a specific phobia. Right? So you want to ask, so parents will often, when you're talking to parents, you're asking them and you want to learn more about specific phobias, and you say, have they ever had, or recently have they been really afraid, more than what might be usual for even Billy, right? Because we want to know baseline, even more than Billy. Have they been really afraid to any kind of animals? Oh yes, for sure. And you want to ask, how long have they been doing that for? Has it been consistent? Or are there times in the last 6 months where he's been totally fine when a dog's there? Or any dogs where he's gone and he's petted and he's been okay with that, right? Oh yeah, actually he sometimes feels scared of dogs, but other times if he feels, if he's well rested, or if he's kind of like, if he's happy, then he doesn't have that fear response, okay? Then it might be something there, something maladaptive, but again, not specific phobia. Okay, so how would we go about treating specific phobia? What's our general strategy if you do identify a phobic response? An enduring, sustained, excessive fear response to a stimuli. Exposure, right? So it always has to adjust. So often you need to work with families to help them with the do's and don'ts of exposure, as well as parent maintaining, caregiver maintaining factors. Or even teacher, educator maintaining factors to potentially that exposure if the stimuli are possible at school, right? So, but at the heart of it, you're working on exposure here. There's no real difference on what we need to do to help if you're identifying that there's a specific phobia, right? The good news is that this is one of the kinds of anxiety disorders that's known to be treated in a single session, right? That it's possible to treat in a single session. That's the good news. The bad news is nobody, as far as I know, has shown that they've done that with people with autism. Okay, that it might take longer. So it might take longer than normal, even what might be typical around exposure, because every time you change, you might get an extreme response or a highly rigid response. But there are enough case studies to show that we can, and trials to show that we can effectively target phobias in people with autism. You know, sometimes you need to develop self-coping, self-statements to help the person. So there might be a cognitive piece. Typically, though, with phobias, you don't really need to do too much education about the content of the phobia. That is, to have kind of the effective response.